Okay, the streaming is on now. So let's start with a new lecture. Today, the second lecture of the class Environmental Impact Assessment. Today, we will introduce the procedure. So we will start discussing about the procedure for building an environmental impact assessment evaluation. First of all, I think it is important to define clearly what we mean by environmental impact. So we may say that an environmental impact can be defined as the effect of any anthropic intervention which caused deterioration of individual environmental components or an environmental system as a whole. In this definition, we have two concepts. The first one is the concept of environmental component, and the second one is the concept of environmental system. We have already discussed last week what we mean by environmental system. Today, we will more focus on the concept of environmental components. We may say more precisely that an environmental impact is the result of interferences caused by an initial source through chains of more or less complex events generating pressures on significant environmental targets with the potential to alter these targets. So an environmental impact is seen as an interference caused by an initial source. From our point of view, typically is an anthropogenic action or an anthropogenic activity. For example, human society needs to build an infrastructure, and during the building of this infrastructure, there may be some different interferences, but besides being initiated by the initial source, these interferences may propagate through a more or less complex chain of events, but in the end generates pressures on significant environmental targets. Also, another important concept in this sentence is that of significant environmental target. What we mean by significant, it will be clear by the end of the class, but by now let's say that a significant environmental impact is an environmental impact that alter in an important way these targets that are of relevance for the study that we are carrying. So schematically, we may say that we have a source, typically an elementary action, for example, project action, like for example, land movement or the building of some kind of a building or for infrastructure. These elementary actions causes a direct interference on the environment. This is seen as the primary environmental target, but as a consequence of this direct interference, we may have subsequent interferences that are of second, third, fourth order or indirect interferences that may cause a changing of the status of the state of the environmental system. Environmental components classically are subdivided into a set of environmental categories. I recall you that we are now discussing environmental impacts, and in order to classify environmental impacts, it is important to identify environmental categories in which these impacts may fall in. Classically, the environmental categories are those that I'm listing here. So atmosphere, water environment, soil, subsoil, vegetation, flora and fauna, ecosystems as a whole, or public health, noise and vibration, landscape, ionizing and non-ionizing radiations. These are all categories under which we may put the various environmental impacts that are in place linked to the concept of environmental impact, environmental categories, there is the concept of environmental risk. So, from a technical point of view, the concept of risk is that of, if you want, a potential impact. An environmental risk may be seen from a technical viewpoint as a potential impact. So, once we have defined environmental impacts that fall under environmental categories, then we may have a further subdivision in which we classify potential impacts. Typically, potential impacts are called risks or are evaluated by risk analysis or risk assessment. We will discuss in detail about risk assessment in the second part of the class. So, a good starting point is that of identification of impacts. First of all, we may accept that in order to identify impacts, we shall first of all look at regulations. So the impacts that we select are in general suggested by the regulations in place. A good idea is that I select those impacts that provide a comprehensive picture of the effect of an action on an environmental system. So what we look for a comprehensive picture. So we look for a set of impacts that covers most of the aspects or a great part of those aspects that are relevant for the systems we are looking at. It is important also to distinguish impacts between different categories. So we may say that there are positive and negative impacts. For example, a positive impact may be that of planting trees, so planting a forest. Negative impact may be seen as that of cutting a forest. But impacts can be extended or limited, extended in space or limited in space, or maybe long-term or short-term, so extended or limited in time. Impacts may be reversible or irreversible, meaning that a reversible impact is simply if we stop the action, the system will automatically get back to its pristine condition. Or impact may be irreversible, meaning that impacts may leave a strong, and persistent footprint on the environmental system. Impacts may be also significant or not significant. So we may also include in the list of impacts some non-significant impact. Of course, we shall not concentrate or lose too many time in evaluating not significant impacts. Instead, we shall focus only on significant ones. And then impact may be direct or indirect. So we may say direct or secondary or tertiary hierarchy impact. Why do we need to select to identify environmental impact? Because one of the scope of the procedure we are going to study in the following lecture is that of allowing comparisons between different project alternatives. So the idea is that we select a series of impacts that comprehensively describe the effect of human intervention on environmental system, and we use this set of impacts in order to compare different project alternatives. Of course, when we introduce environmental impact, we may have a qualitative or quantitative description or information, so that we may say that an impact will be qualitative if we may use some types of characterization, like, for example, good, bad, very good, very bad, or not significant, or maybe also quantitative. Quantitative means that we are able to find numbers or labels, numerical labels, that describe the impacts. We will see several examples of this quantitative way of describing environmental impacts. Of course, quantitative way are preferred because with numbers we can make calculation, elaboration, numerical elaboration. So in order to be the most stable, sustainable, and clear as possible, we would like to have the most extensive quantitative characterization of impacts. Now let's look more in detail to the procedure of environmental impact assessment. The whole class is about these types of procedures. Let's start from the basic one, environmental impact assessment. Environmental impact assessment procedure is an administrative and technical procedure aimed at formulating an assessment of compatibility of a new construction and or a substantial change to the of the construction to environmental impact to the environment. So understood as the set of human activities and natural resources. So we have seen that in the definition of environment, we have quite an anthropogenic perspective in which we say that the environment is the place in which human society can thrive, can prosperate, can grow. So we are looking for a way of evaluating the compatibility of a new construction or substantial changes on an existing structure. So the point is that of evaluating the compatibility. In fact, a typical outcome of an environmental impact assessment is called the judgment of environmental compatibility, as we will see in the following lecture. Environmental impact assessment procedure identifies and describes the status of fact and evaluates the design stage. So we are in an early stage of a project building. So we are in a design planning phase. It is based on a forecast of a possible disruptive effects of initial environmental situation or those impacts generated by the achievement of a project. So the point is that environmental impact assessment should describe the status of fact, so in a design pristine phase, and by describing or by selecting environmental impact as tools for describing environmental status, we try to build forecasts of possible disruptive effects of initial environmental situation. By introducing the term forecast, you understand that we will employ mathematical models that provide forecasts of possible future evaluation of the state of the systems as an effect of environmental impacts caused by human activities or by the achievement of one specific project. What are the objectives of environmental impact assessment? Environmental impact assessment aims at assessing and comparing solutions through analysis of different alternatives, allowing to achieve the goals targeted by the work. So you see that we, in the procedures of environmental impact assessment, we are comparing different alternatives or different ways of implementing a given objective, and we try to evaluate which are the effect of the different alternatives on the surrounding environment. The purpose of this procedure is the prevention and protection of the environment, prevention of negative disruptive impacts and protection of the environment as a whole. These prevention and protection activities should be consistent with the needs of economic development. You may recall that we are gently switching, slipping down to the concept of sustainability, sustainable development. So we are not pretending to impede or to stop any industrial action or any anthropic action on the environment. Instead, we are just trying to find the best way to implement those projects that are significant for economic development of the human society, but we try to select those projects that being significant also display the least important environmental impact. So let's give a look briefly at the story, how this procedure was introduced. It is important to understand the story, especially in order to understand the timings. For example, the first traces of environmental impact assessment may be found in the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, United States, 1969. So as early as the late 70s, we have a National Environmental Protection Policy Act, sorry, National Environment Policy Act. That is the policy act that institutes the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States, EPA. These ideas were transferred up through the Atlantic Oceans in 1976, were introduced in France, les études d'impact, for operations that can have disruptive effects of the environment. So let's say 4 or 5 years after, 7 years after the National Environmental Policy Act, in Europe, first in France, we have les études d'impact. In the European legislation is the second program of the Community Environmental Action 1977 that indicates as an objective the creation of a mechanism to ensure preventive actions. So you see that we have to wait until 1977, the European Union, in order to, the European Community, in order to introduce the first tools to ensure preventive actions against the disruption of the environment due to anthropogenic activities. Then we had to wait until 1985, in which the European Community adopted the first Environmental Impact Assessment Directive, Directive number 337 of 1985 of the European Community Environmental Impact Assessment of certain projects, public or private. And in this directive, it was clearly stated that it should have been implemented into national legislation by the year 1988. So you see that environmental impact assessment procedure is a long story, starting in the late 70s, 1969 in the United States, and then developing through the 70s in Europe until 85 directive that forced or asked to all member states in the European Community to implementing this procedure in their national legislation. So we will have a look through all these legislations in the following lectures. Please remember that when I ask you when environmental impact assessment was first introduced into national legislation, you should go through this timing: 1969 in the United States, 1976 in Europe, and then 1985 in the European Community, in which it is explicitly written, but national legislation should implement this procedure at latest by 1988. Then we have subsequent changes to this environmental policy. But one of the most relevant is 1997, the directive number 11 and 97, that refers only to projects of works. So here the most important innovation in this directive is the inclusion of the screening phase, so a selection of those projects that should undergo environmental impact assessment and those what should not mandatorily. So during the screening phase that was introduced in 1997, it is possible to decide which project should undergo an environmental impact assessment mandatorily and should, however, submit it to the procedure. So it is a kind of the enforcement of the directive of 85, because during the directive of 85, it was stated that certain projects, public or private, so this was very ambiguous. Then we start with directive of 97 to be a little bit less ambiguous by introducing the screening phase, that is a phase in which it is allowed by national legislation. Remember, these are European directives, but should be implemented into a national legislation. So each member state has the opportunity of deciding which project should undergo environmental impact assessment and which are not which project should undergo environmental impact assessment mandatorily, which project, and for which project environmental impact assessment is not mandatory. Why it is important, this point? This point, it is important because, as we will see shortly, environmental impact assessment procedures are quite complex, long, costly procedures that involve a lot of different, portatori di interesse, in English is stakeholders. So several stakeholders, but in particular, several different knowledges are included are needed to carry on a consistent environmental impact assessment procedure. This makes the procedure very cumbersome, time-consuming, expensive, and so this is why it is given the possibility to the member state to decide which projects should undergo environmental impact assessment mandatorily, and which projects instead may go or may not undergo an environmental impact assessment depending on the characteristics of a project, in particular type of project, dimensions, place in which the project is embedded. Then there is another important turn point that is in 2001 with the directive number 42. It's a third important directive not related to projects of individual works. Instead, it has to do, this directive, with the assessment of the effects of particular plans and programs. This is what we call strategic environmental appraisal. So environmental impact assessment is a specific procedure that applies to specific projects, while strategic environmental appraisal is a procedure that classifies plans and programs. So what it changes in strategic environmental appraisal is the horizontal, timing horizon, the time horizon. So strategic environmental appraisal has to do with plans and projects on the long term. So we may say that, for example, um, a construction plan, let's say we decide that it's for let's say for some units of terrain or land, we need to build some kind of environmental protection activities. This is a planning activities or a programmatic activity, is not a specific project. So there is a difference, for example, from the idea of building a specific project. I need to build, for example, a highway, and programming the development of several groups of projects. Like, for example, we need a special network of highways in this area. So in 2001, with the directive number 42, by introducing the strategic environmental appraisal, we have a former tool, but it is of guidance for member countries, for member nations, member of the environmental community, in order to draft out the development plans, developing plans and programs. In Italy, we may say that environmental impact assessment has been implemented by Law 349/1986, which addresses the issue in very general terms and leaves the definition of the details to subsequent legislation. This law text, 349/1986, is very important for the Italian legislation, and it is very important for Italian environmental engineer, because the law 349/1986 is the law that institutes the Ministry of Environment. Before 1986, we did not have any Ministry of Environment. And given that most of the commitments related to environmental impact assessment procedure are devoted or left to the Ministry of Environment, now you understand that this specific institution is very relevant for the environmental engineer. In particular, the environmental engineer is the one that will interact with the Ministry of Environment, is the point of connection between the committant that wants to build a particular construction and the Ministry of Environment that is supposed to check and control by environmental impact assessment procedures that the build of this project, of this structure, is consistent with the requirements of sustainability. Which are the involved subjects on an environmental impact assessment procedure? There are three major players in all the stories. The first one is the proposer, or the developer of the work. The proposer requests the authorization to make it and justifies the choice for the production of an environmental impact study. The environmental impact study is a huge cumbersome document, usually thousands of pages. So a lot of paper, kilograms and kilograms of papers, in which there is a comprehensive analysis of the situation de facto and of the project as it is proposed, and of the possible scenarios or forecasts of what will happen if we build the project, or if we do not build it, or if we apply different solutions. Law tends to distinguish between the developer and proponent. For example, in our region, the Veneto region, the law states clearly that the developer is a private entity while the proposing authority is typically a public subject, like, for example, municipality, il Comune di Padova, may be the proposing authority, while, for example, a specific group of engineering, like the one that built the Mosel, may be seen as the developers or private entities. The second relevant subject is the public administration. The public administration is called at verifying the adequacy of the project and to evaluate the quality of environmental impact studies submitted by the proposer. So it is the proposer that will submit these huge studies, what is environmental impact studies, to the public administration, but it is called to verify the quality of a project. The third very relevant subject is the population involved. The population that may be involved directly or through representatives or of political parties, associations, their delegates, or consultants involved in various ways in the decision process. So very, 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 very significant aspect of environmental impact assessment legislation, and I'm talking about the European level 1985 legislation, 1985 directive, is that of involving clearly, explicitly the population, the public. You may think this is not so important because nowadays you are used to this, but believe me, but this is really a turning point because it was the first time that the public is explicitly involved in a decision process. And as we will see, the laws, the directives, and then the subsequent implemented national legislations are given a set of clear tools or clear procedures that ensures the involvement of the public. We said that the central document of environmental impact assessment procedure is the environmental impact study. The environmental impact studies documents all the studies conducted by the proposer in order to assess the effects of the proposed work on the environmental systems with reference to the environmental components, the factors, the relations between these factors, and the quality of the state of the concerned area or of environment, concerned environment. The environmental impact studies, as explicitly asked by the law, should be developed in accordance with three main frameworks. One, the planning or programmatic framework. So first of all, we shall ask ourselves which are the planning or programmatic guidelines given by the competent authorities for the areas or for the type of project works targeted. The second framework is that of a design or project. So we will have a second part of the study where will be a huge quantity of information concerning the design of the way we are thinking to implement the project that it is targeted. And finally, we need a third framework, that is the environmental framework, in which all the interactions between the project and the environmental situations are studied. Important in the building and drafting of environmental impact study is the discussion of alternatives. As we said, environmental impact assessment procedure is seen as a tool for evaluating different project alternatives. So, in the environmental impact study, we expect to find a discussion of the different alternatives. First of all, we will have a strategic point of view in which we will discuss the search of design alternatives for the realization of the same objective. So we have a particular target. We may realize this target in this way, or this other way, or this third way. So in the environmental impact studies, I'm expecting to find a discussion of all these alternatives. In terms of strategic means long-term, so which is the choice for obtaining a particular objective. Then we will have a localization discussions in which we try to evaluate the placing of particular work. For example, where I'm going to build a waste incineration or a thermal generation, waste thermal plant generation in a particular area. This has to do with the planning work. As you understand, this is linked to a strategic environmental assessment appraisal, sorry. Then, while discussing the alternative, you should evaluate also process or structural alternatives that are only useful in the general or executive design. So in the beginning of the design phase, we expect that the environmental impact study discusses the alternatives in processes or structural terms. We expect to find to environmental impact studies also clearing and mitigation measures that are useful during the executive design and that are very important during the so-called decommissioning phase. So clearing and mitigation measures should be also discussed in the environmental impact studies. In the environmental impact studies, finally, there is also, we expect also to find a discussion of a so-called zero alternative. So it is a kind of feasibility study in practice. It is done because this analysis is done in order to justify the need of a given project. Okay. What are the possible goals of environmental impact study? To choose the minimum impact of the work among more than one project and more than one site. So this is an allocation and optimal choice. So we choose the project and we choose the placing. Choose the work with a minimal impact among more than one project for a single site. For example, we define we are linked to building or to implement our project in a specific site. So we are left with the problem of finding the optimal choice in terms of minimal environmental impact. To choose between a single project and more than one site, this is again a problem of allocation, optimal allocation. To assess the environmental eligibility of a single project for a single site, so this is a problem of remediableness of the project, so it has to do with the decommissioning. Rate the level of environmental acceptability of a work already allocated or for which has already been decided on the creation or allocation. So we may also implement the environmental impact studies, but adopted during the environmental impact assessment procedure in order to evaluate the remediableness or the impacts subject to subsequent amendments of an already decided project implementation. Do you have any questions? No, no rising hand. So you are very attentive and intelligent, and I am very clear in my explanation. This is my conclusions if you are not asking me anything. Okay, let's give a look more in detail to the structure of environmental impact study. This is really the focus of environmental engineer. Typically, the environmental engineer is called to coordinate the drafting of an environmental impact study. So the environmental engineer is called as a consultant to draft an environmental impact study, but it is necessary in order to successfully carry an environmental impact assessment procedure. I recall you that the environmental impact study shall be drafted through three main frameworks: programmatic, the design, and the environmental framework. The programmatic framework reconstructs the programmatic and planning scenario in the project area. Do you remember strategic environmental appraisal? It is a tool provided to evaluate the sustainability and the environmental friendliness of plans and programs that shall apply a particular area. For example, il piano di sviluppo agricolo and agricultural development plan, or piano d'ambito territoriale in Italian, territorial ambit plans, PATs, or piano di sviluppo urbano, urban plans, and so on. These are all programmatic frameworks that shall be considered during the drafting of environmental impact studies. The programmatic framework analyzes the relationships between the proposed intervention and the territorial and sectorial planning and scheduling acts. GUP is an acronym that stands for General Urban Planning. Okay. The designing framework discusses the reasons assumed by the proposer in the definition of the initiative. There is a designing phase development in which you evaluate the technological choices for the project, and you should also identify the causes of interference with the environment as measured in various stages of the project, for example, in the construction stage, operation stage, disposal, or the commissioning of the project of the construction. So during the designing framework of the environmental impact study, the environmental engineer or the proposal should discuss why he have chosen a particular choice, why he have chosen a particular strategy for implementing the work. There should be a discussion and an evaluation of the different technological alternatives, and then there should be a clear discussion of the causes of interference with the environment. In particular, in the environmental framework, I'm expecting to find an analysis of the natural and anthropic components affected by the projects and the interactions between these components and the environmental system taken as a whole. So in the environmental framework, there is a description of the environmental impacts expected by the project has been defined by the programmatic and design phase. In the environmental framework, also to be described, impacts of different nature related to new infrastructure, measures for a correct integration into the landscape and the ecosystem, containment measures of the possible impacts related to emissions of pollutants, for example, measures of compensation and the restoration of sites, monitoring measures, and established control procedures. This is an important, very important point. In the environmental framework, and I recall you, we are in the third framework of environmental impact study, the environmental engineer should also discuss monitoring measures and established control procedures in order to control during the life of the opera, the environmental impact of the opera. So you see, there is a large quantity of information or informational flows that are at play during the drafting of environmental impact studies as a tool for carrying out an environmental impact assessment procedure. A lot of information, so the organization of an environmental impact study requires a rational managing of informational flows. These flows should be quantitatively important, so we need to include the largest amount of information, the largest possible amount of information related to a project and to the environmental context in which the project is will be implemented, but also we need an information that is qualitatively consistent. So we need a lot of information of a good quality. This is why the documentation of environmental impact studies is very important. So you will include in the environmental impact studies a lot of technical documents, like, for example, design scripts and so on. But you will also include non-technical documents aimed at informing the public on non-technical summaries and documentation certifying the publication. Yes.
Excuse me.
This point is particularly important if you remember.
Sorry, Professor.
Yes.
In the previous slide on the information, what does it mean, rational managing of the information? Rational.
Yes. Let me see. Rational.
Rational managing of the information flows. This sentence, what does it mean exactly by this rational managing?
It means that, I will try to be more clear lately, it means that the terminology should be well defined. Once you use one term for identifying one aspect or one object, you should always use this term, and you should try to be more clear as possible. And as I was saying, you include, besides technical documents, also non-technical documents. These are required because, as you may remember, environmental impact assessment procedure is a procedure involving the public as well. So we need non-technical documents that may be understandable by the public at large. But in particular, to answer to your question about what it means by being rational, we need the adoption of a clear terminology in terms of semantics that is associated with the jargon. So semantics means that we use terms for identifying things, and these terms have always the same meaning. So we try not to use jargon, or if we use jargon, we shall define it in a clear way. The adoption of a clear terminology is particularly important because, especially in this sector, the use of understandable but precise technical language is a defined priority. So we need a rational management of information because we need to share information between a lot of subjects. Public means normal person like you and me, but also authorities, public authorities, like for example, the regions, the municipalities, but also very technical subjects, like for example, the engineers, the biologists, economists, and so on. So the idea is that to use a clear terminology in order to create quite a common language that acts as a bridge between different disciplines. As you may understand, by the way we are describing environmental impact study, we have several subjects that are involved in the drafting of these studies, and these subjects come from very different disciplines: engineering, economy, biology, but also politics, but also public and private authorities, and so on. So we need to draft a common language. This is why the terminology is important, and this is why typically the environmental impact studies begins with a series of pages defining the terms that it will be employed during the drafting of this document. Now that we are starting to have a general picture of the procedure, we shall go more in detail into some concepts, like the concept of impacts. Of course, this class is called environmental impact assessment. The procedure is called environmental impact assessment. So now we shall discuss a little bit on what we mean by impact. In general, we may first say that impacts may be seen as interferences on the system, but may be direct or indirect, as I already told you. For example, we need to build how do you say, a waste disposal area, landfilling, waste landfilling area. Direct impact, of course, is that I have to dig and move earth. Indirect impact is that when we will bring the wastes to the area, we will have lorries that will generate, for example, CO2 or other forms of pollution due to traffic. So in this case, in this example, direct is land movement, earth movement. Indirect is traffic pollutions. The former are called also primary impacts, while the latter impacts that are induced elsewhere in space and or later in time are called secondary impact. So the first thing to do to recognize when you are classifying impacts is to classify them under primary or secondary impacts. The removal of soil for the construction of an incineration and plant, for example, is a primary impact. The effects of traffic generated by waste transport is a secondary impact. Other important distinctions among impacts are those related to long-term impacts versus short-term impact. So it is important to understand if the impact, environmental impact, to understand or better to give a time scale describing the timing of environmental impact, long-term or short-term. Important also is to identify if impacts are reversible or irreversible. Also important to identify if impacts are acting on individual environmental components or if impacts are acting cumulatively, so in a synergistic way on more than one environmental component. So now you start to understand that when you talk of environmental impact, you also are talking about environmental components. An environmental impact is something that is acting onto an environmental component. Impacts may be synergetic, so elements of environmental conditions able to destroy or enhance the environmental effects of a work. So you have to take into account while building your list of impact those aspects that may cause an exacerbation of the impact due to a synergetic effect. Or you also may identify sensitive targets, sensitive elements thought to be subject to significant disruption. So an environmental impact may be classified also in terms of the targets on which these impacts act, or the target or the environmental component on which this impact is acting. So we may classify the impacts in terms of being synergistic, or being focused on sensitive targets. For example, sensitive target may be a protective bird species, and if we build, for example, a highway in these particular areas, we are going to destroy the habitat of a bird species that is included into the bird directive. Is the directive which lists the protective bird species in the European environment. In order to classify and to describe environmental impacts, it was introduced in the early 80s, the Leopold matrix, the so-called matrix of impacts. This is a very important tool used to describe or define the effect of a project or of a building on a particular environmental situation. The Leopold matrix, you have on one axis environmental components, like for example, air, water, soil, biosphere, or whatever. Let's say, for example, a particular species of birds or turtles or whatever. And on the other coordinate, you have project activities, like for example, energy production, road construction, waste disposal, or whatever. So the Leopold matrix links different project activities to different environmental components. In order to build the Leopold matrix, you understand immediately that you have, first of all, to split your project into sub-actions or project activities, like, for example, land excavation or planting of trees or whatever. And you have also to identify which are the key environmental components describing the environmental systems in which your opera will be implemented. Again, you understand that this way of classifying impact is highly subjective. It depends on the ability, but I would say also on the tastes of environmental consultant that is charged of building the impact matrix. It is important to understand that this is the first step in constructing an environmental impact assessment. So you identify project actions or activities, you identify environmental components, and you start by linking each project activity to an environmental component. So where the environmental impact appears in this description, the environmental impact appears in the crossing between rows and columns in the Leopold matrix. So each one of these cells represents an environmental impact. In particular, in this cell, we are describing the effect of the activity of road construction on the water environmental component. Typically, historically, we employ two numbers for describing the environmental impact. And these two numbers are called, one, the significance, and may be positive or negative. The impact may be a positive or negative impact, and the magnitude, a number that describes the extension in spatial terms or in temporal terms or in whatever terms, for example, in energy production, CO2 production of the particular activity. I put plus or minus, I put 1 to 10th for magnitude, plus or minus for the significance. These numbers are highly subjective. So it will be environmental engineer with charge of building environmental impact study, who is drafting environmental impact assessment procedure, that will decide which numbers to put or which kind of measures, way of measuring the impacts to put into this cell. It's very subjective, but the scope of the procedures that we are discussing in this class is that of trying to make this procedure the most general as possible, trying to reduce as far as possible, as much as we can, the subjectivity of the procedure. Of course, a certain degree of subjectivity remains, so it is important to find tools that help us in reduce this subjectivity. The first set of tools are modeling tools that will be presented into environmental studies. Modeling tools are synthetic representation of a given reality or schematic representation in order to explicitate the real situation. So we try to describe an environment through a synthetic representation so that we can somehow identify which are the project actions that should be considered in order to evaluate the impact of a given construction or a given work. The second aspect is that of environmental component. What is an environmental component? Is an item or category of elements that constitutes the environment and that are physically somehow definable, and I would say measurable. Environmental components are described or characterized by environmental variables. What is an environmental variable? Is an element that characterizes the state or the dynamic or the dynamic of an environmental component that varies in space and time. So an environmental variable may be, for example, the quantity of nitrate in fresh surface water. That is an important variable describing the status of environmental component, fresh water. An environmental indicator is an environmental variable that is capable of representing environmental situations not directly measurables through physical units. So an environmental indicator is a kind of re-elaboration or combination of different environmental variables with, in particular, a range of variability of these indicators. So we are trying to build an overall description of the system through environmental indicator. Environmental indicators are also characterized, or may also be characterized, by environmental parameters. An environmental parameters is a conventional quantity that measures the value taken by a given environmental variable. So, for example, the solid oxygen, hourly traffic, or nitrate concentration are all environmental parameters. An environmental factor is an environmental component that interacts with other conditioning its states or evolution. So an environmental factor is an environmental component who's described by an environmental parameter that is able to change or condition the states or evolution of other environmental components. Environmental process is the process of transformation of a given environmental reality through intermediate stages more or less recognizable and are determined by a series of internal or external factors. These are all aspects that need to be included into environmental studies. What are the environmental processes at place? Are processes that describe the transformation of set of environmental components described by environmental indicators or parameters due to linked to the actions due to the implementation of a given project. Complex environmental systems is the real environment resulting from interaction of more environmental factors, both natural and anthropogenic. Okay, I stop here by now. Today, if you have any question, I'm here. Or we will meet next Thursday at 10:30 for the next lecture. Do you have any questions? You don't have any questions?
In the chat, there is a question, Prof.
Yes, please.
There is a question in the chat, but not by me.
Yes, wait, let me see. I need to open the chat. One moment. Let me read it. It's a question. Okay, because no, the answer is no. The courses will be held only in this semester. And of course, you may make the examination also the next semester, but I'm not going to continue lectures. I'm not going to repeat the lectures, especially because